Welcome to Bernette's Bizarre but True Tales. Sit back and enjoy the show.
Hello everyone, I'm back and welcome to Bernette's Bizarre but True Tales. Now, I realize almost everyone in the world knows about the misfortune of the Titanic, the iceberg, the sinking, and the tragedy that followed. But what many people may not know is the strange and almost unbelievable story of a woman named Violet Jessop. Violet did not survive just one disaster at sea. She survived incidents on all three sister ships, the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. And if that wasn't bizarre enough, she also claimed to have saved a baby during the sinking of the Titanic, a baby who decades later may have called her in the middle of the night. So tonight, we're stepping beyond the famous story of the ship itself and into the life of the woman history came to know as Miss Unsinkable. So settle in, because tonight's bizarre but true tale is not just about the ships that sank or nearly sank. It's about the woman who somehow walked away from all three of them, carrying a mystery that may have followed her for the rest of her life. There are lives that seem to belong to ordinary history, and then there are lives that feel as if they have been written by the sea itself. Violet Constance Jessop's life was one of the latter. She was born far from the great passenger liners that would one day make her famous, far from Southampton docks, far from the North Atlantic ice fields, and far from the hospital ship that would vanish beneath the sea. Yet again and again, the sea found her. Again and again, disaster rose around her. And again, Violet Jessop survived. She would become known as Miss Unsinkable, a woman connected to all three Olympic-class sister ships, RMS Olympic, RMS Titanic, and HMHS Britannic. One collided with a warship, one struck an iceberg and sank into legend, and one was torn open by a wartime mine. Violet was there for all three incidents, and she lived to tell the story. It is easy, when telling Violet's story, to hurry straight to the disasters, the collision, the iceberg, the mine. Those are the moments that seize attention. But disasters do not happen to symbols. They happen to people. And before Violet became a survivor, she was a daughter, a sister, an immigrant child, and a young woman learning how to make herself useful in a world that offered working women very little softness. But this is not only a story about sinking ships, it is the story of a sick child who was not expected to live, a daughter who had to carry her family's burden, a working woman in a dangerous industry, a survivor who kept returning to sea, and an elderly retiree who one stormy night received a phone call that seemed to reach back across 50 years of memory. So, to understand Violet Jessop, we have to begin before the famous ships, before the newspaper headlines, before the nickname Miss Unsinkable. We have to begin with a girl who learned very early that life could vanish without warning, and that survival was not always dramatic. Sometimes survival was simply waking up the next morning, breathing through illness, helping dress younger children, and doing what had to be done. Violet Constance Jessop was born the 2nd of October, 1887. Near Blanca in Argentina, the oldest child of Irish immigrants, William and Catherine Jessop. Her father was a sheep farmer, and Violet's early years were shaped by the open papa's hard work, family responsibility, and the uncertainty that followed immigrant life. She was the first of 9 children, though not all of them survived into adulthood. Picture Argentina in the late 19th century. Wide distances, hard sunlight, wind moving over open land, and a family trying to build a future far from Ireland. For Violet's parents, immigration meant hope, but hope did not erase hardship. Children were born, work had to be found, food had to be produced, and illness had to be endured, and every member of the household mattered. Violet, as the eldest, would have understood responsibility before she fully understood childhood. From the beginning, Violet's life was shattered by illness. As a child, she contracted tuberculosis, a frightening diagnosis at a time when many families heard it as a death sentence. Doctors reportedly believed she had only months to live, but Violet did what she would continue doing throughout her life. She refused to disappear when everyone expected her to. She survived the illness, and that early escape from death became almost a prelude to the rest of her story. Catherine, Violet's mother, would encourage her to come sit by the fire. "You must keep warm," she'd say. "I am warm, Mama." "And you say that because you do not want me to worry." "Then do not worry, Mom. I am still here. Am I not?" Now, when Violet was still young, her father died, and the family eventually moved to England. Her mother found work at sea as a stewardess, leaving Violet to help care for her younger siblings. Violet received some schooling, but duty called louder than ambition. When her mother became ill, Violet left school and followed her into the shipboard work. The story now moves from the land to the sea. The ocean that once separated the Jessop family from Ireland would become the place where Violet earned her living, tested her courage, and met history at its most violent. That sentence, "I am still here, am I not?" could almost be the refrain of her entire life. It followed her from Argentina to England, from childhood sickness to adult responsibility, from crowded steerage passages to first-class corridors, from lifeboats to hospital wards. Violet's courage was not loud, it was practical. It lived in her hands, in the way she worked, in the way she stood upright when others trembled. At 21, Violet began work as a ship stewardess. It was not glamorous work. Stewardesses rose early, worked long hours, endured cramped quarters, served demanding passengers, and carried the invisible emotional labor of keeping others calm and comfortable. Violet first worked with the Royal Mail Line and later with the White Star Line, the company that operated some of the most ambitious liners in the world. A stewardess had to be almost invisible and absolutely essential. She handled complaints, sickness, children, clothing, cabins, meals, anxieties, and emergencies. She needed discretion with the wealthy, patience with the frightened, strength for the physically exhausting parts of the job, and obedience to a shipboard hierarchy that left little room for hesitation. Violet learned to listen before speaking, to watch before reacting, and to move calmly even when the ship around her did not. Even getting hired was not simple. Some employers thought Violet looked too young and attractive for the job, worrying she might attract attention rather than quietly serve. So she had to dress plainly, made herself look older and more severe, and proved that she belonged. Beneath the modest clothes was a woman of startling discipline, faith, stamina, and courage. By 1911, Violet was working aboard the RMS Olympic, the first of the White Star's three great sister ships. It was enormous, luxurious, and celebrated as a marvel of modern engineering. For passengers, it promised comfort and status. For crew members like Violet, it meant hard work beneath the polished surface. A liner like the Olympic was a floating city, but a city with strict class lines. Above decks, wealthy passengers strolled under electric lights, wrote letters in lounges, and dressed for dinner. Below, crew members hurried through narrow service passages, carrying trays, linens, messages, and worries. Violet learned both worlds, polished public face of ocean travel and the relentless labor hidden behind it. On the 20th of September 1911, the Olympic was leaving Southampton when it collided with the British warship HMS Hawke near the Isle of Wight. The collision tore into the great liner's hull. It was a serious accident, but there were no fatalities, and the Olympic managed to return to port under its own power. One frightened passenger had asked her, "Miss Jessop, is everything quite all right?" And she'd reply, "It's all right, ma'am. Please remain where you are until we are instructed otherwise." "But that sound!" "I know," Violet told her, "but the ship is returning to port. You are safe for the moment, one step at a time." For many people, that would have been enough. A collision at sea, the sound of metal against metal, the knowledge that even the largest ships could be damaged, any of it might have driven a person away from maritime life. But Violet stayed. In fact, she later said little about the Olympic incident. Compared with the disasters that followed, perhaps in hindsight, the crash seemed almost mild. Or perhaps Violet had already learned to put fear aside and return to work. Less than a year later, another sister ship waited at Southampton. It's a newer, larger, and more famous than the Olympic. She carried a name that promised scale and strength. Violet stepped aboard, not knowing she was entering one of the defining tragedies of the 20th century. In April 1912, Violet transferred to the Titanic. She was 24 years old. She had not been eager to go, but friends persuaded her that joining the maiden voyage of the new ship would be a wonderful experience. The Titanic was larger, newer, and grander than anything the Atlantic had ever seen. It represented confidence, money, technology, and the belief that human beings had finally mastered the ocean. The Titanic began with polished railings, fresh paint, bright china, folded napkins, and the confidence, optimism of a world that trusted machines. Violet would have seen passengers arriving with trunks, children, pets, servants, flowers, letters of introduction, and private hopes. Some were going home, some were beginning new lives. None of them knew that within days the name of the ship would mean catastrophe. On the 10th of April, 1912, Titanic sailed from Southampton. 4 days later, on the night of the 14th of April, she struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic. Violet was asleep when the collision happened. At first, the disturbance did not look like the end of the world. But soon, the truth moved through the ship. Water was entering. The ship was wounded, and the impossible was becoming real. "Did you feel that?" one of the stewardess asked Violet. Feel what? Like a shiver through the floor. Violet said, perhaps nothing, perhaps ice. Wait for orders. Why you sound so calm, Violet? I sound employed, Violet replied. Violet was ordered up on deck to help demonstrate calm behavior for passengers who could not understand the officer's English instructions. She put on her life jacket and stood where frightened people could see her. In those moments, her job was not merely to survive, her job was to make survival look possible. Imagine the boat deck, cold air, slanting planks, officers shouting, women clutching children, men staring into the dark, musicians still playing somewhere behind the confusion. For passengers who spoke little or no English, the disaster was even more terrifying. Violet became a human signpost. She showed them how to fasten life jackets. She motioned towards the lifeboats. She used her compassion as a language everyone could understand. Look at me, Violet had said. Put your arms through here. Tie it firmly. That's it. Stay together. Move slowly. Do not run. The boats are waiting. Among the officers working desperately that night was 6th Officer James Paul Moody. In some later retellings of Violet's story, he is identified as the young officer who handed her the baby, though the exact time, identity of the child remains uncertain and the details have been debated. What matters for Violet's memory is the suddenness of it. A child placed into her arms as the lifeboat dropped away from the only world any of them had known. Eventually, Violet was ordered into lifeboat number 16. The boat was crowded, the night bitter, and above them the Titanic still blazed with light. The ship creaked, ropes tightened, people shouted from the deck. Then, as the lifeboat began to lower, a young officer identified in later accounts as 6th Officer James Moody appeared at the rail with a small bundle in his arms. Jessop, he shouted. Yes, sir. Look after this, will you? What is it? A child. Take the baby. Whose child is it? Oh, I don't know. There's no time. Hold tight. But sir, the boat is lowering. Then take it now. Keep it warm. Keep it alive. He leaned down, stretching as far as he dared over the gap between the ship and the lifeboat. Violet reached up. For some breathless second, the baby hung between them, the officer above and the stewardess below. The dark sea waiting beneath. Then the bundle dropped into Violet's arms. Inside was a baby, wrapped against the cold, but helpless in the chaos. In the middle of the freezing Atlantic, with a great ship sinking behind her, Violet held that child close and kept it warm. She became, for those terrible hours, the baby's entire world. Hush now, little one. I have you. Keep close. The cold will pass. Do you hear me? It will pass. Violet had whispered to the baby. Whether the baby understood the words did not matter. The body understands warmth. The body understands being held. In a night filled with separation, Violet became a temporary harbor. For Violet, the baby was not a symbol in that moment. It was weight in her arms, breath against her coat, a fragile warmth in a night that seemed determined to take warmth away. She had no time to ask questions, no time to learn a name, no time to understand whether a mother was searching somewhere above or below. The child simply became her responsibility in the middle of a disaster too large for any one person to comprehend. Violet was given something small enough to hold, and that may have made it even more terrifying. A ship could be lost to history, but a baby could die against her chest if she failed to keep it alive. From the lifeboat, Violet watched the Titanic sink. The lights went out. The noise changed. Then came the voices in the water, a sound survivors would carry for the rest of their lives. Lifeboat 16 drifted through the darkness until the rescue ship, RMS Carpathia, arrived. Survivors later described the waiting as one of the worst parts, the dark water stretching in every direction, the cold settling into bones, the uncertain silence after the ship disappeared. In a lifeboat, there is nowhere to look that does not remind you of what has happened. Violet held the child and listened. Around her, people prayed, wept, whispered names, or stared as if stirring might bring the ship back. When Violet reached the Carpathia, still holding the baby, a woman suddenly came towards her. Without explanation, without thanks, and without giving Violet a name, the woman took the baby from her arms and disappeared into the crowd of survivors. Violet never knew who the child was. That mystery would wait in silence for decades. The woman on the Carpathia had said to Violet, "Give me the baby." And Violet asked her, "Is the child yours?" The woman repeated, "Give me the baby." And then the child was gone. No name, no explanation, no ending, only absence. Violet had carried a life through the night, and by morning, even that small human connection had disappeared into the crowd. Some mysteries are powerful because they remain incomplete. If Violet had learned the baby's name, the story might have ended neatly, but instead the unanswered question followed her through the years like a faint sound beneath ordinary life. The world changed between the Titanic and the Britannic. The age of luxury liners had not vanished, but war had darkened the sea lanes. For Violet, returning to a sister ship meant stepping back into a familiar shape under entirely different circumstances. The third sister, HMS Britannic. 4 years later, the world was at war. Violet returned to the sea, not as a stewardess on a luxury liner, but as a voluntary aid detachment nurse. The third sister ship, Britannic, had been converted into a hospital ship. She was meant to carry the wounded, painted, and fitted for wartime medical service. War changed the meaning of every voyage. Corridors where once carried dinner trays now carried stretchers. White paint and red crosses replaced the glamour of peacetime service. Violet, dressed as a nurse, was no longer simply tending to passengers' comforts. She was moving through the machinery of war, caring for wounded men and sailing through waters where danger was no longer accidental but deliberate. On the 21st of November, 1916, Britannic struck a mine. The explosion tore into the ship and water rushed in. Unlike the Titanic, which took more than 2 hours to sink, Britannic went down with terrifying speed. Lifeboats were launched while the ship was still moving, and some were drawn towards the enormous propellers turning in the stern. "What was that?" one nurse had asked Violet. "An explosion." "Are we sinking?" "Move! Ask later. Help the patients first." Violet was used to this. There was no time for ceremony, no orchestra, no long freezing wait under the stars. Britannic was dying fast, and every decision was compressed into seconds. Violet saw the danger. Her lifeboat was pulled toward the blades. She jumped into the sea. The water swallowed her, and as she struggled beneath the surface, her head struck part of the ship. She survived, but later it was discovered that she had suffered a skull fracture. Once more, she had come close to death to feel its hand, and once more she escaped. In that moment, Violet's survival depended on instinct. Stay in the lifeboat and risk the propellers, or jump into the sea and risk drowning. She chose the water. The shock would have stolen her breath. Salt would have burned her throat. Above her, the great hull loomed. Behind her, the blades churned. She fought upward, struck her head, and still somehow reached life. Not again, Violet thought. Not this ship too. We do not know if she said those words, but it is difficult not to imagine the thought passing through her as the hospital ship tilted and the sea climbed higher. A third sister, a third disaster, a third time Violet had chose life inside chaos. Why the three sisters became disasters? The three Olympic-class ships were linked by design, ambition, and tragedy. Their disasters were different. The Olympic did not sink. She collided with the HMS Hull and returned to port. The Titanic struck an iceberg and sank in the North Atlantic. The Britannic, altered after Titanic, was improved. Safety features was lost in wartime after a mine explosion. Their stories became entwined, not because they failed in exactly the same way, but because one woman stood at the center of all three events. To passengers and newspapers, these vessels were symbols of progress. To Violet, they were workplaces, corridors to clean, passengers to reassure, cabins to manage, lives to protect. That is what makes her story so powerful. She was not a celebrity passenger or a wealthy observer. She was working, serving, helping, and obeying orders, and surviving. It is tempting to make Violet into a legend and leave her there, frozen forever in a lifeboat beneath the stars. But legends can flatten people. Violet was not only a survivor of disasters, she was a woman who had to earn wages, make choices, endure loneliness, manage memories, and live through ordinary Tuesdays after extraordinary nights. That may be the hardest part of survival, not the moment when everyone is watching, but the long years after, when the world expects you to have moved on. After Britannic, Violet did not abandon sea. She continued her maritime career for many years, serving passengers across changing decades of ocean travel. Her life included work, travel, an eventual brief marriage, and the quiet accumulation of memories few others could have borne. She spent more than 40 years connected to ships before retiring. There must have been days when the sea felt ordinary again, breakfast served, cabins prepared, passengers asking for blankets or tea, ports appearing and disappearing beyond the rail. But memory has its own weather. A calm crossing could still contain the echo of a lifeboat, a whistle, an unanswered name, or the shock of cold water closing overhead. In retirement, Violet settled into a quieter life in Suffolk. She gardened, kept hens, and lived far from the noise of ship engines and crowded decks. Yet the past did not entirely leave her. The ocean had taken so much from so many people, and Violet carried stories that remained unfinished. And then, long after the great ships had become history, after the headlines had yellowed and survivors had aged, one small song pulled Violet back into the night of 1912. a telephone ringing in the dark. The house was dark, the weather wild, and the ring of the phone cut through the silence. When she answered, a woman's voice asked whether she was the Violet Jessop who had saved a baby on the night the Titanic sank. Violet answered that she was. Then the woman said, "Well, I was that baby." After that, according to the story, the caller laughed and hung up. That phone call unsettled Violet because she said she had not told that story widely. Her friend and biographer, John Maxton Graham, later suggested it may have been a prank by local children, but Violet resisted that explanation. Whether the call was mischief, coincidence, or something stranger, it became one of the most haunting details attached to her life. A voice from the past, reaching across the years to the woman who had once held a nameless child in a lifeboat. And then came the laugh. What was all that about? And the line went dead. Violet was left with the receiver in her hand and the past standing in the room beside her. Was it a cruel joke? Was it a coincidence? A true voice from the child she had protected. The story offers no proof and no tidy answer. It leaves us exactly where Violet was left, listening to silence after the storm, wondering whether some memories ever truly end. Violet Jessop died on the 5th of May, 1971 in Suffolk, England, at the age of 83. The official cause was congestive heart failure. She had survived tuberculosis, bereavement, hard labor, a collision, 2 sinkings, a war, icy water, a head injury, and the kind of memories that might have crushed another person. Her story endures because it is almost impossible to believe and yet deeply human. Violet did not seek disaster. She did not perform courage or applause. She simply kept going. She worked, she helped, she survived. And in a century fascinated by grand machines and tragic wrecks, she reminds us that history is not only made by captains, designers, and headlines. Sometimes it is carried quietly by a stewardess in a lifeboat holding a baby against the cold. Violet Jessop's life asks us to think differently about survival. Survival is not only escaping the moment of danger, it is carrying what happens afterwards. It is living with memory without letting memory become the whole self. It is returning to work, answering the next bell, helping the next person, and choosing ordinary life after extraordinary fear. She was not unsinkable because nothing could harm her. She was unsinkable because harm came again and again, and she rose. A child once expected to die became an old woman with a story that outlived the ships themselves. The sea took steel, light music, and countless lives, but it did not take Violet Jessop. Here is a side note. During my research, I found that there were reportedly 11 babies aboard the Titanic on the night it sank. Some records connect the baby in Lifeboat 16 with Assad Alexandra Thomas, who was about 5 months old at the time. However, Assad died in 1931 at the age of 19, long before Violet Jessop's later life retirement and mysterious midnight phone call, because Violet said the caller was a woman claiming to be the baby she had saved. This detail makes the phone call even more questionable. It may have been a prank, a case of mistaken identity, or part of the legend that grew around Violet's extraordinary life. And this is the bizarre but true tale of Violet Jessop, the woman who survived the impossible not once, not twice, but again and again. from a sick child in Argentina to a stewardess on the most famous ship in history. Violet's life reads like legend, but it was real. She survived the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. She carried a baby through one of the darkest nights at sea, and decades later, whether by prank, memory, mystery, or fate, that story came back to her in the form of a midnight phone call. So the next time you hear the story of the Titanic, remember there was another story floating in its shadow. The story of Violet Jessop, Miss Unsinkable, and the sea that tried 3 times to claim her, but never could. If you enjoyed this bizarre but true tale, make sure to like, follow, and subscribe to Bernette's Bizarre but True Tales for more strange stories from history that sound unbelievable but really happened. And let me know in the comments, do you think the midnight phone call was a prank, a coincidence, or was it truly the baby Violet once said coming back to remember her? Until next time, stay curious, stay spooky, and keep questioning the stories histories leave behind.